By now, many of you have probably heard that Bill Nye is getting a new show. I'd like to preface this by saying that I hold no ill will toward Bill or his new show. On the contrary, it is because of my respect for him as an educator on scientific issues that I feel I must out him when he puts his feelings in front of the facts. If Bill conducts himself during his new show in the manner that he did in Bill Nye the Science Guy, I won't have a problem. In that TV show, he presented himself as an educator and informed a young audience on the facts surrounding scientific phenomenon. If, however, he chooses to do this new show in the style that he did in The Eyes of Nye, I am going to have a problem. Using his image as an impartial educator, Bill Nye abused his power in The Eyes of Nye in order to present his subjective opinion on issues as objective scientific fact. A primary purpose of this video is to highlight many examples of him engaging in this behavior. If you ever had suspicions as to Bill Nye's objectivity, this video will be all the proof you need. For those of you that are confident in his unbiased scientific opinion, I challenge you to feel the same way by the end of this presentation. If you clicked on this video's thumbnail, you did so with the understanding that it would involve a breakdown of an argument from Bill Nye. And for those of you that are fans of his, but came here ready to hear me out, I respect your ability to approach the other side of the argument with an open mind. Such a disposition is imperative to the future of intellectual discourse, and despite recent trends suggesting otherwise, it is my hope that this disposition will not fade away. For those of you that came here already confident that Bill is correct, I would ask that you carefully consider the information that we look over here today. I know it's easy to be drawn in by him. I wouldn't blame you. He has a likable personality and approaches most things scientifically. But be careful when venerating people. Remember that everyone has their own agenda, and it's very difficult to always remain objective. From his initial position regarding GMOs and nuclear energy, I am of the belief that Bill considers himself a progressive Democrat first and a scientist second. But we aren't fighting his ideology today, we're debating his argument, so let's take a look at the episode. The Eyes of Nye was a TV program hosted by Bill Nye that was intended to present current scientific issues to the general public. Unlike his previous show, Bill Nye the Science Guy, The Eyes of Nye was aimed at more of an adult audience. Originally, I was going to do a video debunking his GMO episode as well, but Bill has already come out recently and actually changed his position regarding genetically modified foods, which bodes well. It is my hope that his opinion similarly changes regarding nuclear energy, especially considering that he is citing against the vast majority of the scientific community on this issue, just as he was with GMOs. Not much of a spokesperson for the scientific community if he's disagreeing with the majority of them, huh? Today, we'll be breaking down the Eyes of Nye episode, Nuclear Energy, released April 24th, 2005. We will be deconstructing the narrative of the entirety of the video, and it's going to get very in-depth and technical, so buckle up. If your knowledge concerning nuclear energy is a little shaky, don't worry. Bill has a few segments in his video in which he explains the science behind nuclear energy's power generation, as well as half-lives and transmutation. All of these explanations are scientifically accurate and serve as good foundations for understanding the subject. When we come to these segments, I will be showing Bill's explanation without interruption. When Bill is presenting actual scientific fact, there is no narrative to be deconstructed. Now, on to the video.
Nuclear waste. It's dangerous for centuries. It needs to go away. And now, it will. One, two, three. Shoot! 1, 2, 3. What am I doing wrong? 1, 2, 3.
Boy, if only it were that easy. Now, the persistent paradox that is nuclear power. It's efficient. One train car full of nuclear fuel can keep a nuclear power plant running for a year. But it takes a whole train load of coal every day to keep a conventional power plant running.
This is just another example in a very long line of clear advantages that nuclear power has over coal. Have you ever noticed how the smoke billowing out of the top of nuclear power plants is much lighter than that of coal plants? That's because it's actually water vapor, not carbon dioxide. In other words, nuclear power plants do not pollute the atmosphere.
lot of things to be afraid of when it comes to nuclear power. There are meltdowns where the uranium metal fuel gets so hot that it burns a hole through the reactor and the whole thing explodes.
Oh God. What? What's this?
The whole thing explodes.
Bill is intentionally using specific words in order to make this issue sound a lot more terrifying than it actually is. Nuclear power facilities do not have the capability to explode into mushroom clouds. Bill is making it sound like the facility could become ground zero for an atomic explosion at any time. This is misleading. What he is actually referring to is the possibility of old reactors to experience a meltdown as a result of mistakes being made in the operation of the facility. Now, all things considered, nuclear meltdown doesn't exactly have that great a ring to it either, but it's actually a lot less dangerous than people think. When most people think of nuclear meltdown, they probably imagine radiation flooding the surrounding area and mutating the plants and animals. This vivid, horrifying image is a fabrication put in place by nuclear energy's opponents in order to frighten you into obedience. The truth is, nuclear meltdowns, with the sole exception of Chernobyl, and we'll get to why that is later, have all been contained within the facility, and to this day are still contained inside the facility. To quote the World Nuclear Association, licensing approval for new plants now requires that the effects of any core meltdown accident must be confined to the plant itself, without the need to evacuate nearby residents. In addition, once again with the sole exception of Chernobyl, no one has ever died as a result of a nuclear meltdown. Yes, even at Fukushima, there were no deaths. To again quote World Nuclear, the use of nuclear energy for electricity generation can be considered extremely safe. Every year, several thousand people die in coal mines to provide this widely used fuel for electricity. There are also significant health and environmental effects arising from fossil fuel use. To date, even the Fukushima accident has caused no deaths, and the IAEA reported in June 2011. To date, no health effects have been reported in any person as a result of radiation exposure. Subsequent WHO and UNSCAR reports have also supported this.
There are terrorists who could get hold of some of this nuclear material and make the events of September 11th look like getting a parking ticket.
All right, let's talk about the terrorism argument against nuclear energy. First, terrorism is an argument you can use against anything. Why build tall buildings if they can just be knocked down by terrorists and fall onto people, causing even more damage? Why have cities so densely compacted if it allows terrorists to easily kill multiple people with a single explosive device? The answer is that if we live our lives as if we fear terrorists, the terrorists win and become more encouraged to perpetrate acts of violence in the future. We must be prepared to combat terrorism, but not cower in fear of it. But I'm almost veering off topic here. Let's hear what Bill just said again.
There are terrorists who could get hold of some of this nuclear material and make the events of September 11th look like getting a parking ticket.
Once again, we see that he is intentionally using scary words in order to invoke an emotional reaction from his audience that, for the most part, isn't informed enough about nuclear energy to know better. Let me present an actual argument, minus the buzzwords to scare people into listening to me. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that anyone at any point, be it a terrorist group or an actual political state, has attempted to produce a nuclear weapon with the same isotopic composition of modern high-burnup reactor-grade plutonium. None. And this is why, quote worldnuclear.org, while of a different order of magnitude to the fission occurring within a nuclear reactor, plutonium-240 has a relatively high rate of spontaneous fission with consequent neutron emissions. This makes reactor-grade plutonium entirely unsuitable for use in a bomb. However, reactors also use plutonium-238 and plutonium-239. In practice, these isotopes behave pretty similarly to uranium-235, so I'll just talk about uranium enrichment, and you can rest assured that the same will be true of those plutonium elements. Nuclear power plants typically use the uranium isotope U-235, the very same isotope that was used in our first atomic bomb. I'm sure all those anti-nuclear organizations have already told you as much, but allow me to add the vital information that they always seem to conveniently leave out. I'm going to pull a couple quotes from the Hiroshima syndrome here and say, naturally occurring uranium cannot be used to make a bomb because it is not a natural explosive. Natural uranium is a uniform mix of two isotopes, uranium-238 and uranium-235. Natural uranium is 99.3% uranium-238 and 0.7% uranium-235, which when milled and collected is referred to as yellowcake uranium. U-238 is such a poor neutron-induced fissioner under any conditions that we can correctly say it won't experience a chain reaction in any way, shape, or form. It's the uranium-235 that makes the nuclear chain reaction possible because it is a very good fissioner relative to U-238. However, U-235 doesn't fission very much when bombarded by high-energy neutrons, which is the kind of neutrons released out of the fission. In order to make a bomb core that will actually explode, the uranium-235 concentration must be increased to in excess of 90% to produce enough immediate fissions to make an explosion possible. This highly concentrated form of U-235 is necessary for a detonation. Anything less won't work. This is in no way a secret, at least not anymore. The uranium-235 concentration needed to make a bomb that works can be easily found in library encyclopedias and numerous websites on the internet. Regardless, anything less than a 90% uranium-235 concentration and you can't make a weapon small enough for a deliverable bomb, even if launched by a powerful rocket. In theory, a ridiculously enormous amount of uranium with about a 20% U-235 concentration is possible, but in no way realistic. The bomb would be bigger in diameter than the Empire State Building is tall. Less than a 20% concentration of uranium-235 and a nuclear explosion is absolutely impossible, no matter how much of the material is amassed. However, this is the reason that 20% enriched uranium and plutonium are defined as weapons grade. The 1 to 3% U-235 and/or plutonium-239 in reactor fuels cannot explode, regardless of how much is amassed. So, what does all that mean? Well, reactors use a version of the uranium-235 isotope, typically enriched to about 3%. This is relatively benign and at the perfect level for generating power efficiently. Atomic bombs, on the other hand, use uranium-235 enriched to the 90th percentile. Once enriched that far, it becomes unstable, and the resulting release of neutrons contains so much energy that it causes enough immediate additional fissions to make the explosion happen. It is physically impossible for the uranium enriched below the 20% margin, like the reactor fuel, to explode. I believe Peter Beckman said it best when he quipped, "If a terrorist manages to blow up a nuclear power plant, he should be given a Nobel Prize because he'll have discovered a new law of physics." All that being said, we still have a bit of a problem. How exactly is the fuel enriched past the 3 percentile margin that's used in reactors to the 90th percentile margin that's found in atomic bombs? If it's a simple process, there is still an issue with terrorists getting their hands on the reactor-grade fuel and turning it into atomic-grade fuel. Allow me to put your minds at ease. The enrichment process primarily uses two different methods, gaseous diffusion and a gas centrifuge. Though other methods, like laser separation and whatnot, do exist, diffusion and centrifuge enrichment is by far the most common. In the description to this video, I'll be linking the passages from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's official website explaining both methods. The key takeaway from both of them is that they are loud, expensive, and require an enormous facility in order to be operational. So were a terrorist to somehow steal reactor fuel from a nuclear power facility, accepting that they could actually get away with stealing a radioactive isotope from some of the most secure locations in the United States, They would then need to enrich it, using one of the enrichment methods in order to use it for an atomic bomb. In order for that to be possible, they would then need to break into an enrichment facility, kill all the security on site, and defend the facility against a very pissed off and highly alert US military for about 7 months until the enrichment process was complete. In addition, after enriching the material, they would then need to create an atomic bomb using the material. It's not a matter of simply attaching the enriched material to an explosive. According to current estimates, in a best-case scenario, this process would take about a year. In addition, depending on what type of bomb they were intent on creating, it would likely be necessary to steal reactor fuel from multiple facilities. The amount they got from just one wouldn't be enough. Simply put, there is no way a single person or group of individuals operating independently could manage to steal the isotope from multiple facilities, stay hidden whilst enriching it for a year, and then create an atomic bomb using the enriched material over the course of another year. So, was Bill outright lying here when he said that a terrorist could use nuclear material to do something terrible? No, but he used wording that made it sound like an entirely different scenario could take place. Could a terrorist make a makeshift atom bomb with reactor-grade nuclear material? No, absolutely not. No conventional terrorist without being part of a large multi-million-dollar operation funded by an outside country could do this. And in such a scenario, any multi-million-dollar operation funded by another state with access to a secret centrifuge could likely just make their own nuclear bomb without the need to steal any material. But could a terrorist make a dirty bomb with radioactive waste? Yes. Although Bill tried to imply much worse, this is what he was actually referring to. But to quote the academic paper, Dirty Bomb Hazard Assessment and Probability Matrix by Crittenden J. Kennedy, though a radiological dispersal device, RDD, would be designed to disperse radioactive material over a large area, a bomb that uses conventional explosives and produces a blast wave would be far more lethal to people than the hazard posed by radioactive material that may be mixed with the explosive. At levels generated from probable sources, not enough radiation would be present to cause severe illness or death. A test explosion and subsequent calculations done by the United States Department of Energy found that assuming nothing is done to clean up the affected area and everyone stays in the affected area for 1 year, the radiation exposure would be fairly high, but not fatal. Recent analysis of the nuclear fallout from the Chernobyl disaster confirms this, showing that the effect on many people in the surrounding area, although not those in close proximity, was almost negligible. Since a dirty bomb is unlikely to cause many deaths by radiation exposure, many do not consider this to be a weapon of mass destruction. Its purpose would presumably be to create psychological, not physical, harm through ignorance, mass panic, and terror. For this reason, dirty bombs are sometimes called weapons of mass disruption. Additionally, containment and decontamination of thousands of victims, as well as decontamination of the affected area, might require considerable time and expense, rendering areas partly unusable and causing economic damage. So to summarize this enormous interjection so that we can get back to the episode, nuclear power plants cannot explode into mushroom clouds, and the danger posed by dirty bombs is almost non-existent.
The real terror, the real danger, the real horror of nuclear power may come long after the power is generated, with nuclear waste. Now, do science and society have an answer for this problem?
Yes, actually, we do. It's called Yucca Mountain. I'm sure we'll be discussing it soon enough.
Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. Let's have a look.
He went from science sweetheart to nuclear skid row. Hear about his rise, fall, and valiant climb back on The 9 True Science Story. After World War II, America found a new hero, a hero whose name would be known around the world. Our friend, the atom.
I was young and cocky. You know how it is. When you're young, you think you can do anything.
Indeed, his future seemed limitless.
That stuff was made up by the press and my promoters. I never said I could do all that stuff.
Well, let's take a look at these claims. First up, cheap energy. Well, that depends on how you look at it. While it is true that nuclear power plants are typically much more expensive to build than other power plants, it is also true that they are significantly cheaper to run. Miracle drugs are much more ambiguous. What is meant by this? If you're referring to exposure to radiation being used as a treatment for certain types of diseases, then yes, that does occur. I'm sure everyone has heard of chemotherapy. In terms of, say, pharmaceuticals, no, of course not. No one is putting uranium or plutonium in a pill and calling it a miracle. But even if they were, what is your argument here? That the medical industry is in bed with the nuclear energy industry? Can you even begin to remotely substantiate that claim? Finally, spaceships to the moon. Nuclear fission? No. But nuclear fusion? Yes. Both are considered nuclear power. We just haven't invented an effective method for capturing fusion energy yet. Make no mistake, once we do, it might just change the entire world. Allow me to explain. For the purposes of making this analogy simple to understand, I am going to compare nuclear energy and atomic bombs. Note that they are similar in this respect, but different in many others. Generally speaking, when you hear a comparison between the two, I would suggest that you look farther into it, to make sure that someone is not just attempting to play on your fears surrounding the word nuclear. Now, the original atomic bombs were fission bombs, meaning that an atom was split to produce the explosion. The Fat Man, of the two bombs, yielded the biggest explosion at about 20 kilotons. Now, however, the big-name countries are generally more interested in nuclear fusion bombs, which combine two atoms to produce the explosion and have much greater yields. The Tsar Bomba, the largest bomb ever tested, was a fusion bomb. It produced a 50 megaton blast. The Tsar Bomba produced an explosion 2,500 times the size of the Fat Man. Here's a picture to put that into perspective. In a similar vein, nuclear fusion power produces significantly more energy than nuclear fission power, which is already one of the most efficient forms of energy generation on the planet. The moment we master the method of capturing nuclear fusion energy, the world's energy crisis might just be over. This is actually another argument for continuing the research into nuclear energy, given that hopefully it will one day lead to a breakthrough in nuclear fusion. If we were going to travel to another planet, rest assured, our best hope for doing so would be nuclear fusion. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. NASA has made a number of statements concerning the viability of nuclear fusion as a method to propel spacecraft.
The 60s generation turned against Mr. Atom.
All of a sudden,
You cannot conflate nuclear power with nuclear weapons like this. This would be as if I said that we should no longer pursue advancements in medical science because it allowed us to more efficiently engineer a bioweapon. The focus is on the medical science, not the weapon.
I'm not the friend anymore, you know? All of a sudden...
Okay, show me a single, irrefutable, documented case wherein someone was irradiated who lived near a nuclear power facility that was operating as intended. Want to know why you can't? Because obviously everyone knew that radiation leakage was going to be a concern, so there are regulations in place that do not allow a nuclear power facility to leak a certain amount of radiation into the surrounding area per year. Let me provide a couple quick examples of radioactive phenomena. Look around the room you're currently sitting in right now. Is it made of concrete or brick? If so, you'll be happy to know that you are currently experiencing higher than standard levels of radiation. On average, according to the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, your standard American civilian receives a dosage of about 620 millirems of radiation a year. For comparison, the standard X-ray is about 40 millirems. Now, your radiation comes from a multitude of sources, including soil, food, cosmic radiation, and yeah, even your homes. Brick and concrete houses, for example, add about 7 millirems to your yearly dosage because they're slightly more radioactive than other building materials like wood. You wouldn't happen to live within 50 miles of a coal plant, would you? Well, if you do, add 0.03 millirems to your yearly dosage. Now here's the important bit. Do you live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant? If you do, according to the EPA, you'll have to add 0.009 millirems to your yearly dosage. So if you're following, you won't fail to note that not only do nuclear power plants release less radiation to the surrounding area than coal power plants, but that living in a brick house is more than 700 times worse than living within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant.
I'm not cool! That really messed me up!
This is one of the big famous events that the anti-nuclear community likes to use to scare you. I'm sure Chernobyl is going to follow mention of this incident. Did you notice how all Bill did was name the incidents and mention that there was a meltdown? Isn't the reason why it melted down also important? Well, of course, but not if they want to scare you into compliance. Further information would destroy their narrative. Allow me to shed some light on some very common misconceptions surrounding this incident. 3 Mile Island happened as a direct result of negligence on the part of the facility operators and cannot possibly be contributed to an inherent problem in nuclear energy itself. In order to perform routine maintenance, the facility operators closed key valves that would have allowed emergency auxiliary pumps to activate, and because they did this, it resulted in the chain reaction that caused the meltdown. The action of closing the valves was in violation of Nuclear Regulatory Commission rules. They didn't follow the correct procedures necessary, and their mistakes led to the accident. Also, of interesting note, there was a very compelling study conducted right after the events of 3 Mile Island that I think will be particularly enlightening on the divide between Bill's position here and the position of the scientific community. The survey I'm about to reference was conducted on a series of scientists that appeared in the book American Men and Women of Science, which was a series of biological reference books on leading scientists in the United States and Canada. Now, these books were originally published in 1971, but the surveys actually took place in the 80s. Allow me to read a short excerpt. Many analysts have attempted to explain the visceral hostility toward nuclear power, and the most common explanation is that people link nuclear power with nuclear weapons. Others say it is simply irrational fear. Although fear of unfamiliar technology is understandable, it hardly explains the organized opposition from those who are well-educated and technologically literate and who have given the movement its legitimacy. There is, however, a different question one might ask. To what extent have such fears been exploited and encouraged by nuclear opponents for reasons that are more ideological than scientific? 2 surveys taken in the 1980s speak volumes on this question. In 1982, a random survey of scientists listed in American Men and Women of Science sought to describe with some objectivity the attitudes of scientists toward nuclear power. The survey was conducted roughly a year and a half after the accident at 3 Mile Island, a time when virtually every environmental organization claiming to act on the best science had lined up in opposition. At the time the survey was taken, a poll had reported that almost 1 in 4 Americans believed that a majority of scientists who are energy experts opposed further development of nuclear energy. For years, the media had hammered home the message that there were deep divisions within the scientific community about nuclear power, a message that reinforced the legitimacy of the anti-nuclear movement. But the results of the scientists' survey showed overwhelming support for nuclear power. Nearly 90% of the scientists surveyed believed that nuclear power should proceed, with 53% saying that it should proceed rapidly. So why would the entire environmental community be on one side of the nuclear question while, overwhelmingly, scientists were on the other?
There's not a day goes by that I don't wish I could go back and...
Ah, there it is. Chernobyl, the worst disaster in nuclear power's history. I'm gonna go ahead and quote from worldnuclear.org on this one. The Chernobyl accident in 1986 was the result of a flawed reactor design that was operated with inadequately trained personnel. 2 Chernobyl plant workers died on the night of the accident, and a further 28 people died within a few weeks as a result of acute radiation poisoning. The United States Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation says that apart from increased thyroid cancers, there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 20 years after the accident. The April 1986 disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine was the product of a flawed Soviet reactor design, coupled with serious mistakes made by the plant operators. It was a direct consequence of Cold War isolation and the resulting lack of any safety culture. The disaster was a unique event, and the only accident in the history of commercial nuclear power where radiation-related fatalities occurred. However, the design of the reactor is unique, and in that respect, the accident is thus of little relevance to the rest of the nuclear industry outside the then Eastern Bloc. So to summarize, it was a result of negligence in design, negligence in operation, and is no longer even applicable, given the enormous differences in design and operation that we see in nuclear facilities today. Let this be a reminder, should you ever encounter anyone that tries to bring up the Chernobyl accident as if it is still comparable to modern nuclear energy, you are well within reason to inform them that the two are utterly different, and that they are in essence comparing a tricycle to a rocket ship. The trouble with informing people of this false equivocation is that it isn't particularly visible. One can easily see the difference between a computer in the 1980s and the modern iPhone 6, but nuclear reactors still look roughly the same, despite having made a similar magnitude of advancements within the last 30 years. And therein lies the method with which these anti-nuclear fanatics are manipulating people. Unlike computers, reactors haven't really changed the way they look on the outside, despite being radically different within. This allows the anti-nuclear organizations to fool people into believing that they haven't changed at all, and that Chernobyl is in any way still relevant.
Change all those errors. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can we stop? I need a break. Just a sec. It was rough. I thought I was all bad. There's been some mistakes in the past, but I'm not ready to pull the plug just yet. America still needs me, and I'm going to find a way to be our friend, the atom, again.
This is the Columbia Generating Station, the only nuclear power plant in the Pacific Northwest, but there are 103 nuclear power plants in the United States operating today. The big tall building's the reactor, the big lower building is the generator, and the round buildings near us are the cooling towers to keep the steam going through the electrical generating cycle. At a nuclear power plant, everybody who comes in gets checked out by guys like these. It's a pretty secure place.
That they are. They're secure in order to prevent, I don't know, terrorists from getting a hold of some of their nuclear material and making the events of September 11th look like a parking ticket somehow.
Under here is the reactor. 30 meters down, when the reactor's running, there's uranium fuel making heat. This is a classic demonstration of a nuclear chain reaction, the kind of reaction we have in a nuclear reactor. The mousetraps represent uranium atoms that we get by digging up ore from the ground, and the ping pong balls represent the subatomic particles called neutrons. Now, to start a chain reaction, we bombard the uranium atoms with extra neutrons, or in this case, an extra neutron. The reason this nuclear chain reaction is possible is because uranium has the rare ability to absorb a neutron, which will make it split or fission into smaller fragments. As uranium splits, it releases a lot of energy in the form of heat. It also spits out a neutron of its own, which can bombard a neighboring uranium atom, which then itself fissions, releasing heat and sending out another neutron, and so on and so on. In the reactor, the heat created by fissioning uranium heats up water, making steam. This high-pressure steam blows on the propeller blades of a turbine, which spins the shaft of a huge generator. Now, in the generator, a coil of wire is spinning in a magnetic field, which makes electricity. So it all boils down to this. The reactor, the steam, the turbine, the fuel, everything is set up to drive this big generator. It turns 30 times a second and makes electricity for close to 3 million people. It makes 1.2 gigawatts. It's a lot of juice. A nuclear power plant can generate a lot of electricity, but in nature, we don't get something for nothing.
What? That doesn't make any sense. Not everything in nature is give and take. It's logically fallacious of you to always assume that for every good thing there must be a downside. Don't impose your pessimistic worldview on everyone else just because you think there must always 100% of the time be sacrifice. How would anything be gained? If something equally terrible happened to us for every good thing we did, we couldn't have possibly advanced at all. Our inventions would have been balanced out by this mythical yang to our yin you're suggesting exists.
So when we generate electricity, we also get tons of radioactive waste. How much waste do you make in 60 years?
Well, in 60 years, we would produce enough waste to basically fit contained into a convenience store.
That's not very much.
Well, it's not very much when you compare it to like a coal plant where, you know, its waste of all the coal that it uses and emissions into the environment.
Probably 10 million times that.
Yeah.
So the stuff is dangerous.
It's dangerous, but it's contained in a small volume.
The fuel rods are taken from there into this pool. This is where they're stored for years. When they first come out, they're too hot to handle. They cool off, and then they're eventually taken to dry storage. And there are reactor pools like this all over the world, just waiting for a place to put the waste. What is this, Larry?
This is a dry cask storage for spent nuclear fuel.
Is this radioactive?
There's radioactivity inside it. We've got concrete overpack that protects us from the radiation.
How thick is that?
Oh, it's about 22 inches. Total about 24 inches, including the steel.
You can just stand right next to these. You can touch these.
Oh yeah, it's completely safe. And you can see by looking at the meter, it's less than 1 millirem per hour on contact.
Barely a millirem.
Per hour.
Put that in perspective. What's a dental X-ray? 20?
Dental X-ray is probably about 20 millirems.
So right up next to it, it's less than an X-ray, which is only on for a few moments.
Yes.
Right. Suppose we just left it here. How many years or centuries would it take for this stuff to be benign?
The current average estimate is about 10,000 years.
10,000 years. That's a long time.
Yes, it is.
And there's something about these that doesn't look like they're good for 5,000 years.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
Okay, this guy is clearly advocating that it is safe and easy to store nuclear waste in this manner. When pressed, he admits that they won't last for 5,000 years. However, Bill, I'd like to ask, how do you think they got there in the first place? Do you think that for some reason they won't follow the operating procedure of carefully dealing with the waste in the future and just decide to replace the canister in a manner that is entirely unsafe within the next 5,000 years? No, of course they're going to go about putting the fuel in a replacement container following the same safety procedures they used to put it in the first one the first time they did it. Funny enough, this all seems to be operating under the assumption that we will have the same problems with storing nuclear energy in 5,000 years. Do you honestly believe that we will not have advanced as a species whatsoever given 5,000 years? We can't even imagine the complexity of our technology given that time frame. Technological advancement occurs at a rate that is exponential, not linear. I doubt we'd even be able to comprehend how incredibly complex our society would be given 5,000 years. Do you know where we were 5,000 years ago today? The Neolithic period just ended and Stonehenge was being built.
Radiation is technically any energy that radiates. So light, heat, microwaves, and radio waves are all radiant energy. Now this type of energy is often easy to contain. Microwaves can be contained with nothing more than a metal screen. Light can be blocked with nothing more than a piece of paper. The more paper you have, the more blocking you get. Now in nuclear reactions, our problem is what we call ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation can smash into the tissues of living things and disrupt our cells. A high dose can kill you in a few seconds, or a few minutes, or a few days. Lower doses can disrupt your DNA and make you sick. That's how it causes cancer. So we need to keep people and things from getting irradiated in the first place, and pieces of paper aren't going to do it. Scientists in the nuclear industry often use concrete and stainless steel, built up in layers as much as 3 meters or 10 feet thick. See, with enough shielding, you can contain even nuclear radiation. You see, in this game, rock beats paper.
The first United States nuclear power plant began commercial operation in 1957.
Wow, that is neat, Mr. Sanders.
And we'll build more reactors because they're clean and completely safe.
My father says spent fuel from reactors is radioactive for thousands of years and is dangerous.
Don't worry, Mary. The scientists in the future will fix everything.
Dangerous given that we have no reliable method of disposing of it, which we do in Yucca Mountain. And yes, while it is ridiculous to rely on scientists in the future will fix everything as your only solution, rest assured it's just a backup to an already solid plan.
Mr. Sanders, can't nuclear power plants have meltdowns and kill people?
That sounds like a lie that the communists made up, Tommy.
More of a half-truth that whoever produced this video is perpetuating. Can nuclear power plants melt down and result in the deaths of people? Yes, and that has happened a grand total of 1 time. The Chernobyl incident resulted in the death of 31 people. That's it. Nuclear energy has experienced other fatalities in its time span, of course, but none of them are attributed to meltdowns. But wait, don't other forms of energy result in death too? Wind turbines fall on people from time to time, and the mining of neodymium, the metal present in solar panels, can be deadly. I present to you How deadly is your kilowatt? We rank the killer energy sources. An article from Forbes by a Mr. James Conca. As you can see, of all forms of energy, nuclear power has resulted in the fewest deaths of any energy source.
But my father told me that too, Mr. Sanders.
What's his name? I'd like to write it down in my little book.
I'm going to tell my father what you're doing, Mr. Sanders.
Is nuclear power really that dangerous, Mr. Sanders?
Oh, yes, Tommy. I just didn't want to admit it to that know-it-all Mary.
If you had your way, what would you do with the waste?
I'd put the waste in Yucca Mountain.
There's an idea.
Now, why do you like Yucca Mountain?
Well, it's the best method preferred to date for dealing with spent fuel storage.
Do you think there'll ever be a better method?
You never know what some engineer's gonna think up down the road, so I can't say it's the best.
Look out there. Looks like we're in the middle of nowhere. And in a sense, we are. We're out here near Yucca Mountain, where we're going to store nuclear waste. But it's only 100 miles from there to Las Vegas. That's not very far at all.
Yes, in the middle of the desert, where no one is going to stumble across it accidentally. 100 miles is extremely far, twice the distance the US Department of Energy required. Saying that it is not very far is not only purposely misleading, it's a downright lie.
Especially if you have to keep that waste away from people for 10,000 years.
Well, we're on Yucca Mountain crest, about 5,000 feet above sea level. The repository would be almost directly beneath us.
How far?
About 1,000 feet down to the repository, about another 1,000 feet beneath that to the water table.
1,000 feet underground and 100 miles away. But still not far enough away for Bill, apparently. Who cares about this scientist whose job it is to assess the safety of this facility? This actual expert on the issue. If Bill Nye's science guy says it's not very far, well then, it's not very far.
Why Yucca Mountain? Why here?
I think the top reasons are it's a very dry site. We don't get much rain out here at all. It's a very remote location. It's many miles away from many population centers. And a third reason I would say because of the rock. Because the rocks themselves are very stable, and there's a large enough block of rock to be able to accommodate the nuclear waste.
In 1987, Yucca Mountain was chosen as the best site to evaluate for a long-term national nuclear fuel repository. Using this specially developed boring rig, a system of tunnels known as the Exploratory Studies Facility, or ESF, was created inside the mountain to allow scientists to examine and test the rocks.
This is volcanic tuff, and it's the material that was ejected from a volcano. You want the rock to be strong and stable and to be able to support the tunnels and drifts into which people and the waste would have to go.
But what if it gets wet? That's the thing, right?
Well, that is the big question, Bill, and that's a lot of the studies that we're doing out here are looking at how does water move through the mountain? How much water is there? How could it come in contact with the waste? But remember, Yucca Mountain is in the Mojave Desert. We only get between 4 and 6 inches of rain a year here. It's an extremely dry environment. We've got one of the deepest water tables in North America here. If you don't have water, there's really no other mechanism for the radionuclides to come in contact with the public.
How many miles of tunnel would there be ultimately?
The amount of tunnel we would need to emplace 70,000 metric tons is approximately 65 miles of tunnel.
And how many do you have so far?
Right now we just have these two, and these are not part of the repository. These are part of the exploratory studies. They would not be used for emplacement.
Do you think this facility will do the job storing 70,000 metric tons?
I believe it will. Being a researcher, I have confidence in science and engineering.
And 10,000 years?
10,000 years.
Rain, shine, earthquakes, we're good.
As a scientist, I believe it's good, but I make no guarantees.
As we can see, even when pressed, this scientist informs Bill that he has every confidence in the capability of this facility.
It's going to be very hard indeed to build a structure that's earthquake-proof, leak-proof, and erosion-proof that lasts at least 10,000 years. It's never been done.
Wait, hold on, back up a sec.
Do you think this facility will do the job storing 70,000 metric tons?
I believe it will. Being a researcher, I have confidence in science.
It's going to be very hard indeed.
And engineering.
And 10,000 years.
10,000 years.
It's never been done.
Did you not just talk to an expert scientist on this subject who told you that Yucca Mountain could do just that?
Consider the pyramids.
What do the pyramids have to do with anything? They're 5,000 years old. Civilization, architecture, and engineering have come a long way since then.
They're some of the longest lasting civil engineered structures on Earth. But every single one of them has been broken into. And the vandals and archaeologists who got in were not deterred in any way by big, heavy stone walls or spooky curses. Maybe they just couldn't read the hieroglyphic warning.
I don't even have to say anything about this comparison. I'm sure all of you can already see it for exactly what it is. This is textbook false equivocation, and an insult to every person alive today pursuing a career in architecture or engineering.
Now, the pyramids were built by thousands of Egyptians working together, and the structures have lasted a long, long time. But they did not protect the valuables inside. What makes us think that we can?
Oh, I don't know. 5,000 years of progress?
So is Yucca Mountain a good idea?
Yucca, I'm worried, is going to be one of the worst environmental mistakes that our species has ever made.
Here we go. I'm sure every scientist Bill has spoken to so far has been biased, but this man must be the picture of objectivity. Honestly, it's a little insulting the way they try to portray him as an unbiased expert here, but cite the organization he is the president of right underneath. I'm sure it was done to lend an air of false authority on the subject, but it's as if they never expected anyone to actually look this organization up. Let's take a look, shall we? As you can see, right here on the front page of the website, we have article after article celebrating the closure of nuclear power plants. But I'm sure that's not indicative of anything. Oh, and look over here, under the Issues tab. I'm sure none of those issues are intentionally worded in such a way as to make nuclear power sound dangerous or anything. But hey, maybe I'm generalizing. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and check out their About Us page. Here we are. I'm going to go ahead and highlight a couple passages that I found particularly interesting. An unholy alliance between large, powerful, polluting industrial interests and captured regulatory agencies, captured by the industries they are supposed to regulate. The use of the word polluting is interesting, in that here it's being used as an adjective similar to corrupt. These people know full well that nuclear energy does not pollute the environment, but they also know what happens when you juxtapose the word pollute with any power generating facility you don't like. In this way, they are saying that nuclear energy pollutes in the sense that it corrupts, but I think it's abundantly clear what they are trying to do with that kind of word choice. Secondly, they claim that the regulatory agencies have been corrupted, or should I say polluted, by the nuclear industry, using such emotional language as unholy without actually providing any proof. When a polluter can externalize its costs of doing business by avoiding the expense of safely handling radioactive materials or adequately cleaning up contamination by transferring the risk to the surrounding public in the form of extra cancers and genetic defects. What? These are blatant scare tactics used to terrify the public into joining their cause. I would love to be provided any evidence at all that backs up this asinine claim that nuclear energy is causing increased cancer and genetic defects to residents in the surrounding area. When it is cheaper for a polluting firm to make a campaign contribution to a political figure assuring significant access to and even control of regulatory agencies by those very interests that are supposed to be regulated. Again, I am gonna need citations for such an outlandish claim. You know all these charges you're leveling are illegal, right? If you have proof of any of this, I would strongly advise seeking legal action. And when captured regulatory agencies and their associated industrial interests resist appropriate measures to protect nuclear facilities and materials from catastrophic radiation releases that could result from a successful terror attack. Firstly, there are safeguards in place that protect against catastrophic radiation releases. But obviously this is why the nuclear industry is opposed to regulation. They all clearly want terror attacks to be more frequent and much easier to carry out. I mean, are these guys for real? Are they really insinuating that the nuclear industry doesn't care about protecting their facilities from terror attacks? Riddle me this. What happens if a terror attack is successfully carried out on a nuclear facility that is somehow vulnerable to it? How do you think public perception would change regarding nuclear industry? What do you think would happen to funding for nuclear power? But enough of this fear-mongering. I'm getting tired of seeing public danger in every sentence. Let's take a look at their accomplishments, shall we? It took several years of work for us to help end the practice of ocean dumping of radioactive waste, or to shut down the Hanford N reactor, and with it, U.S. plutonium production. 5 years to shut down the UCLA reactor and press the NRC to require the removal of weapons-grade uranium from most research reactors, a process unfortunately not yet fully complete. Okay. A decade to close the dangerous Department of Energy nuclear facility at Santa Susana, a struggle over many years to block the proposed Ward Valley nuclear dump near the Colorado River, and so on. Social change is not for the sprinter, but for the long-distance runner. Okay. Oh man, where do I start with this? Weapons-grade uranium? Well, you weren't finding 90% enriched uranium at nuclear facilities, so I can only assume you were just removing uranium-235 from facilities altogether, which is utterly ridiculous. I'd love to know for sure, but again, you have neglected to provide even a single source to back up any of these claims. I love the admission at the end that this is a social change, though. At least that part was honest. At no point was any of this ludicrous drivel ever tied to any factual information, nor clearly will it ever be. This is an organization that opposes nuclear energy for the same reason that the ignorant majority of Nevada oppose it. It sounds scary. Over the last few years, we hit the nuclear industry and regulators again and again over efforts to deregulate radioactive waste, each disclosure building on the previous one, increasing momentum. Each victory leads to the next. Each builds momentum, educates the public and media, and increases pressure on decision makers to eventually do the right thing. The right thing, in this instance, being a complete and total end to nuclear energy. I think I've seen just about all I need to see concerning the goals and values of this organization. Now, who was it again that Bill was interviewing? Ah, yes, the president of this organization. So let's hear the testimony of this man who not only has ties to an organization that very clearly has an agenda, but that he himself is the president of. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in America more biased on this subject than the man Bill is currently speaking to. Let's watch the video try to pass him off as an independent expert giving an objective opinion.
Primary scientific arguments for Yucca Mountain was that it was very dry and that the geologic formation was such that moisture would not penetrate into the mountain, get into the radioactive waste, and migrate for hundreds of thousands of years. But that argument went completely out the window when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission dug out a little cavern within Yucca Mountain and put in sensitive equipment to find out if there was moisture. After 6 months, it turns out they lost all their data because there was so much moisture in the cavern that shorted out all the electrical equipment.
I searched high and low for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission finding in which moisture was detected. I was genuinely surprised to find that it did not exist. The description he gave of the equipment malfunctioning seemed at the time a little overboard, but I did not actually anticipate that his entire statement was completely fabricated. In the interest of fairness, I'll show some related documents and areas in which I searched. Firstly, by checking the timeline on yuccamountain.org, the official website for the project, at no point does it ever mention such a study taking place. One could argue that they might be biased though, so let's dig even further. Search queries on the NRC's official government website also do not turn up records of any such study having taken place. But hey, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places or using the right keywords. Tell you what, let's check the Committee to Bridge the Gap. I'm sure they've cited this study somewhere in some paper or another. Aha, here we go. 50 Years of Power, 500,000 Years of Radioactive Waste, written by a Mr. Why, look at that. Dan Hirsch. Let's find his reference to the study. Citation 34 at the end of a quote nearly identical to the one given in the video eventually brings us down to here, an article from the Las Vegas Sun entitled "Water Damage Sparks Yucca Worries." Gee, Dan, that's not an official government study. What's more, the Las Vegas Sun, as in the Las Vegas? The one concerned with the prospect of a nuclear waste repository being built so near to it, despite the fact that 100 miles away is beyond the recommended distance, and it has been certifiably proven to be safe. Wouldn't Las Vegas, I don't know, fearmonger in order to shut down such a scary repository that was turning away ignorant but frightened potential customers? But hey, unlike the Committee to Bridge the Gap, I don't throw around baseless accusations with little to no evidence. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and check this article out. Maybe they cited the actual government study. Nope. It's almost as if no such study exists. In fact, this is practically acknowledged within the video. Take a closer look at the images that Bill displays on the screen when referring to the incident that Dan is describing. Those aren't scientific studies. Those are newspaper articles. It seems an awful lot like Bill also had trouble finding the study referenced. It's easy to see where Dan is getting his misconception from in the article, though. We're going to go ahead and call it a misconception in order to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, he could simply be inattentive and not actively trying to misrepresent the facts. I'm going to highlight a couple passages from the article here that I think he's drawing his false conclusion from. By September, scientists realized that the equipment's electricity had failed, including the backup battery power. When they reopened the research rooms in January, they found electrical shorts that appeared to be caused by excessive water. Appeared to be. Given the fact that the particular research study in which this happened was replicated in the future and they never ran into this situation again, not to mention the fact that they didn't get nailed for this by the EPA, I'm going to go ahead and venture to say that the evidence of water was not very conclusive. The probes could have malfunctioned for any number of reasons, and it only happened one time. You don't get to insert your own reason for the malfunction without any evidence and then point to it as fact, especially when it just so happens to benefit your cause. The report on the failed experiment was included in monthly reports of the NRC's on-site scientists who are overseeing work by the Energy Department. As I mentioned earlier, if the single experiment that failed for unknown reasons was included in the report and they did not get nailed for water detection, considering that was the #1 thing the EPA was looking for, it's ridiculous to cite this study as evidence of water. So far, none of the studies have definitively shown a problem, but none has ruled out dangerous levels of moisture either. Well, that's it then. We've conclusively shown that no study was conducted in which this moisture was proven to cause a problem, in the very article that Dan cited as proof of moisture having caused a problem. This automatically makes Dan either ignorant or a liar. His example of the equipment malfunctioning due to moisture is effectively conjecture. He cannot and has not proven that, even if he just levied that accusation on a nationally televised program. How ethical of him. The amount of moisture inside the mountain already has raised questions from independent scientists serving on the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. At a February meeting in Amargosa Valley, the scientists questioned DOE representatives closely about soaked drip clothes hanging from the alcoves. Okay, come on, is that all? What about the shadows on the moon proving the landing was fake? What about jet fuel not being able to melt steel beams? You're going to need a lot more evidence than some wet lab coats, you ridiculous conspiracy theorists. And to put the metaphorical cherry on top, Patrick Rowe, a Yucca Mountain Project senior scientist, called Yucca Mountain one of the driest locations in the country. According to the Nuclear Energy Institute, Yucca is one of the few places in the world where radioactive waste containers can be isolated from the environment by 1,000 feet of dry rock above them and yet be 1,000 feet above the water table. There is an incredibly large amount of evidence, one might say a mountain of evidence, showing that Yucca Mountain is extremely dry. You are going to have to do a lot better than a quote from the local newspaper to disprove this tried and tested fact.
So they changed the rules. They changed the rules so that you could now in your model rely upon the canister in which the waste was put.
This actually did happen, but not in the way that he is describing it. What he is referring to were the standards proposed by the EPA in 2001, which were then challenged in court by the NRC for being too stringent. At the same time, the state of Nevada, as well as many environmental and public interest groups, challenged the same standards for being too lenient. Finally, in 2004, the U.S. Court of Appeals made its decision, in which it ruled in favor of the NRC on all accounts except for one, the 10,000-year standard, saying that it was too short a time frame according to the National Academy of Sciences, and that it must be extended. The final ruling was that Yucca Mountain had to limit radiation dosage to the surrounding area for 1 million years of operation.
And even that doesn't get them very far because no one has built any canister that's lasted 10,000 years. And 10,000 years, which is the period they say is going to degrade in, almost all of the plutonium is still left.
I gotta say, he is completely 100% correct on this one. No one has built a canister that's lasted for 10,000 years before. You know, I don't think we've yet unearthed even a single nuclear fuel storage canister from the Mesolithic era yet. I'm beginning to think that ancient civilizations didn't even build any.
So where did 10,000 years come from?
It's completely arbitrary. The Department of Energy's models were showing that the peak exposure was at 300,000 years and that they couldn't meet the standard. So at that point, the Department of Energy had estimated that the canisters didn't start to degrade until 11,000 years. So they said, why don't we have to comply with the rules only for the first 10,000?
You're right. 10,000 years was completely arbitrary, and it was an attempt by the NRC to circumvent the rules to cut cost. I think there's an argument to be made on whether 10,000 years is really that bad a time frame, given the incredible technological advancements we will have likely made by that time. But for the purposes of the regulations here, that's irrelevant. It was a mistake, and it was corrected. That's the important part. The new time frame, set by the very rule change you were just lamenting moments ago, is 1 million years. Well over the duration proposed by the NAS.
Plutonium is the most dangerous thing that human beings have ever made. It will probably be our demise. A millionth of an ounce, the size of a speck of dust, if inhaled, will cause lung cancer.
Well, it's clear why you're the president of this organization. You seem very adept at using manipulative wording and phrasing to terrify people into believing you. Allow me to shine some light on this verbal sleight of hand he's employing. A millionth of an ounce of plutonium will indeed cause lung cancer, which is why we have security measures in place to prevent any of the substance from coming into direct contact with people. Case in point, no member of the general public has ever died due to plutonium-induced cancers. Otherwise, you'd see anti-nuclear fanatics citing it to the high hills. But the real crux of this phony argument comes from the next sentence, and if you've been paying attention, you probably know what's wrong with it.
A few pounds, the size of a grapefruit that you can hold in your hand, will bring down a city if used in a nuclear weapon. And it has a 24,000-year half-life.
Is it true that a few pounds of plutonium, the size of a grapefruit, can bring down a city when used in a nuclear weapon? Yes, but Dan is referring to weapons-grade highly enriched plutonium here, not reactor-grade plutonium, which, to repeat the quoted statement I used much earlier, is entirely unsuitable for use in a bomb. So he's actually talking about two completely different types of plutonium here, but by juxtaposing his description of them, he is making it sound as if the plutonium used in nuclear reactors can be used in a bomb. He is doing it in this conniving way because he knows full well, or at least I hope he does, that to say such a thing directly would be a complete lie. But so long as he simply implies a correlation without outright stating it, he's not technically lying.
We measure radioactivity in what's called half-lives. You see, the atoms in radioactive material spontaneously just break apart or decay. Now, we can't tell when an individual atom will decay, but we can tell when a fraction of them will. So a half-life is the amount of time it takes for half the atoms in a piece of radioactive material to break apart. Now, plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. So let's say this red water is the plutonium in a spent nuclear fuel rod, fresh from the reactor. Well, after one half-life, 24,000 years, diluting this water by half, it looks like this. After two half-lives, 48,000 years, it would look like this. After 10 half-lives, 240,000 years, the water starts to look pretty clear. Now, plutonium is notorious. It's especially radioactive. It's 20 million times more radioactive than uranium dug from a mine. You see, we're not talking about potato salad left out in the sun. We're talking about plutonium. Now, the legal requirement for storing this material is only 10,000 years.
Not anymore, it isn't. The ruling was over by the time this video was made. How do you not have access to this information?
That would be over here someplace. That's not even half of a half-life.
Exactly, and they extended the duration of the safety standard up from 10,000 to 1 million years. They didn't succeed in closing the facility, however, because it passed all safety regulations with flying colors. So you do know about the ruling. Why have you been throwing out that false 10,000 number then? You could have merely stated that it was the first guideline given by the EPA and then talked about how it got updated. Instead, you intentionally misled your audience into believing that the NRC were still getting away with a 10,000-year time frame, despite all the scientific evidence that showed such a safety standard was unacceptable.
So what should we do with all this waste that we have right now?
So what we're about to do, I think, is amongst the worst things that we can do, which is to move ahead with a project that we know technologically can't contain the waste.
Then prove it. I am getting seriously tired of these flagrant accusations with absolutely no evidence presented to back up the claim. What do you mean, can't technologically contain the waste? Not a single shred of evidence is ever presented in favor of this claim, nor can I find any credible source online claiming anything similar. Are you somehow privy to special secret damning evidence against Yucca Mountain that the EPA does not have access to? If so, why not release it and verify the validity of your claims? Since you are so clearly against storing all the waste in a facility designed to do exactly that, and which has passed every ridiculously stringent safety regulation ever hurled at it like a political missile, I am positive that you must have a much better solution.
So what we should do, and most independent experts believe this is what we should do, is that the high-level waste should remain at the site of generation, the reactors, for 50 to 100 years. It needs to cool off anyway before you can handle it more safely.
Which independent experts are telling you this? I want names. That's insane. You want us to keep doing dry cask storage on site of nuclear reactors? I thought nuclear reactors were unsafe. This makes absolutely no sense. Yucca Mountain is forced to undergo even more stringent safety regulations in terms of storage than even the nuclear reactors are, and still passes them. But rather than store them at the site proven to be safer, you'd rather let them sit on site of nuclear reactors? I honestly think that'd be safe too, but I think Yucca Mountain is even safer. Eventually we're going to run out of space at the reactors, you know. We can't just keep making dry cask pimples on site. It has to go somewhere eventually.
And during that time, intensive research to come up with a better way of dealing with it than just digging a hole in the ground and putting it there.
Okay, anything sounds stupid when you put it like that. Oh, there's got to be a better way to put a man on the moon than strapping explosives to the bottom of a metal cylinder while he's in it. Oh, there's got to be a better way to generate energy than just heating up some water and having the steam push a piston.
It's hard to conceive of technology more dangerous and a species less capable of handling that danger.
Chimpanzees, dolphins, matter of fact, absolutely any species we know of other than mankind. This is just a thinly veiled misanthropic attempt to make himself sound like he is humble or realistic. Dan apparently suffers from human guilt and is attempting to assuage some of that guilt by disparaging his own species. I don't think anything more needs to be said about how little this man's argument is based in objectivity and fact when he hates the most intelligent and incredible species on planet Earth.
Good evening. My guest is Congressman Peter Newton, and the topic is nuclear energy. Congressman, what about the fact that reactor-grade plutonium could be used by terrorists to make weapons?
Did you catch what he did? Now, if you've been listening, the first thought that should pop into your head is, no, it's been proven that reactor-grade plutonium cannot be used to make a nuclear bomb. But listen closely.
What about the fact that reactor-grade plutonium could be used by terrorists to make weapons?
He didn't say nuclear bomb. He just implied it. He's referring to the topic we discussed much earlier, in which terrorists could strap reactor-grade plutonium onto a separate explosive device and detonate that. This sort of intentionally misleading and malicious wordplay is why you have to pay close attention when listening to anti-nuclear arguments.
Well, that's bad. So I would have to say I am against nuclear energy.
But you could also argue that in over 50 years of using nuclear energy in the U.S., no one has ever been killed in a nuclear power accident.
Completely true. And in fact, nuclear energy has caused the least amount of deaths of any energy source to date.
That is good. Count me in on that.
And then there's the enormous cost of disposing of nuclear waste.
Not if you store it in Yucca Mountain. And the cost is offset by the gain in energy anyway. If the facilities were not making money, they would not be built.
We cannot afford that. Nuclear power has got to go.
But if it does go, we'd lose the source of 20% of our electricity here in the U.S.
A very good point. I would love to hear the argument that Bill has against that particular issue.
Exactly. There is no way I'm going to tell the good people who elected me to use 20% less electricity. Read my lips. We need nuclear energy. Period.
Let's try this. Gum tastes good.
I have always stood up for gum. They will never take gum away.
Oh ho, what's this? Using world nuclear as a source as well, are we? Well then, it's good to know that you can't argue against me using them as a source too. The worst part about this statistic is that it gives no measurement for exactly what 300,000 tons of waste means, practically speaking. Firstly, I'm inclined to believe the 300,000 tons metric, because although I could not find the specific estimate listed here as coming from the World Nuclear Organization, I did find an account published by the International Atomic Energy Agency of the UN, entitled Estimation of Global Inventories of Radioactive Waste and Other Radioactive Materials, which put the estimated global amount of nuclear waste for the year 2000 at 233,000 tons. However, allow me to read this passage from the text. In reality, a fraction of this spent fuel has been reprocessed, producing therefore radioactive waste of different classes. Various literature sources provide gross amounts of reprocessed fuel within the civilian sector. For example, the Nuclear Energy Institute reports that 75,000 MT of spent fuel have been reprocessed worldwide up to the beginning of the years 2000. Of this total, France has reprocessed more than 10,000 MT of spent fuel, and the UK has reused more than 15,000 MT of uranium recovered through reprocessing. Some of the waste that is counted in the global total number is actually reprocessed and used as fuel in cases that are applicable. So in reality, the global total amount of waste is likely a much smaller number than it appears.
300,000 tons and growing. Scientists have spent nearly 60 years and billions of dollars researching and testing, looking for a solution to this problem. They've come up with some pretty interesting ideas, like burying waste under the ocean floor.
Now to the layman, this method probably sounds extremely dangerous. Wouldn't dumping the waste into the ocean just pollute the world's oceans? Yes, dumping nuclear waste directly into the ocean does result in pollution, but that's not what the suggestion was. I say this because the London Convention banned the disposal of nuclear waste into the ocean as of 1972, and it makes no distinction on dumping into the ocean and burying the waste beneath the ocean floor, which are two entirely different disposal methods. There are other objections to this method, obviously, but the main issue with it is that until 2018, when the ban lifts and the treaty is renegotiated, it isn't even possible from the outset.
Dropping it into a hole in the Earth's crust.
I'm actually not going to fault Bill for saying this one wouldn't work. At the time, that was probably true. Now, however, in 2016, the US Department of Energy is currently conducting an experiment with a 3-mile deep borehole in Rugby, North Dakota. The diameter of the borehole is roughly about 2 feet wide. The hope is that everything will work out as the plans have drawn up, and if this turns out to be a reliable method that they can reproduce, we can start using it to store high-level waste like spent nuclear fuel. It is currently estimated that in order to contain the nuclear waste from the entirety of the United States, we will need somewhere around 800 boreholes. So, you know, no concrete evidence on this one yet. We're just going to have to wait for the results. But fingers crossed.
Tunneling under remote islands and leaving it there.
To quote Engineering, Geology, and Construction by Fred G. Bell, disposal of radioactive waste on a remote island involves the placement of wastes within deep geological formations. It also relies on the unique hydrological system associated with island geology. The remoteness, of course, is an advantage in terms of isolation. However, this method carried with it many issues, as listed on scientiapress.com/nuclear waste, as well as the Yucca Mountain project website. The issues typically are as follows. 1. Risks of ocean transport, especially bad weather. 2. Earthquake and volcanic activity. 3. Penetration of island formations by seawater and freshwater, leading to leakage. And 4. The opposition of nearby countries. So, in essence, this method is currently not a favorite of mine. Bill might be right in saying that this currently isn't a good option.
Or stashing it in the polar ice caps.
According to the world nuclear findings on this method, it was investigated by the US and Russia and showed some degree of promise, but it was rejected by countries that have signed the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, and since 1980, this method has been considered a dead end.
So far, all these plans prove to be unmanageable, too expensive, or just too dangerous.
Unmanageable due to political, not pragmatic issues. Too expensive if you don't offset that expense with the massive amount of revenue gained as a result of nuclear power. And too dangerous, I would only argue, in the case of the remote island storage, and maybe seabed storage if something were to go horribly wrong.
But what about shooting the waste into outer space? We would be rid of it forever, and it could just fall into the sun or maybe expand with the universe.
That is true, and research is being conducted into that field even now. Now, this guy surprised me. This is an actual accredited scientist that Bill is speaking to, not some biased loon from an organization that is explicitly anti-nuclear. This man is clearly knowledgeable in this subject and represents a position that is highly informed. While I accept that such a person could theoretically exist that opposes nuclear energy for some reason I am not yet aware of, seeing Bill interview an actual nuclear scientist that agreed with his position set off my further investigation alarms. Of course, upon looking into Dr. Serapis, he is all the show claims him to be. But I thought I'd take it a step further. I got into contact with Dr. Serapis personally, and we exchanged a number of emails discussing the subject of nuclear energy and waste disposal. Based on our conversation, in which he stated that he is very pro-nuclear, I have come to the conclusion that they have grossly misrepresented his position in this segment. I mentioned perhaps doing a video like this one, and indicated that I would love to quote him, but of course would understand completely if he declined to be quoted. To my delight, however, he responded that he wouldn't mind at all if I used his responses to, as he put it, start the conversation. So, I will be detailing his response to some of my further questioning as we move through some of his quotes in this section. Now, I will say that there are times that I disagree with his position, but that's okay. I recognize that he is highly knowledgeable in his opinion, and likely arrived at the conclusion he did from a reasonable and rational perspective. I will strive to debate each of his claims that I disagree with in a professional and respectful manner befitting a man of his standing. However, before we get to his quotes from the interview, I want to point out a couple things he said to me that I feel are of important note. In my first email to him, I said, "Hello, Dr. Serapis. I hope this email finds you well. I stumbled upon an episode of the Eyes of Nye TV program the other day and was surprised at some of your criticisms leveled at nuclear waste disposal. I recognize that your field is directly associated with the practices involved in nuclear waste disposal, and as such, these sorts of issues are very important to you. I would like to ask if your opinions on nuclear waste disposal have changed in any way over the years, or if they have simply been more affirmed, and why. I would be very interested to know. With appreciation, OA." He responded, "I'd have to rewatch the episode to remember which quotes they actually used. We talked on camera for about 2 hours to get the 90 seconds they used, but I can try to answer your second question generically and see if that helps. Overall, I'd say that my opinions about the technology and science of waste management and high-level waste disposal are still very positive. If we had a clear objective and politics were not part of the equation, I have no doubt that the waste management community could handle the material safely and effectively. However, the political process of citing a repository and supporting a multi-generational project in a political culture that changes directions every 2 years, if not faster, has probably lowered my enthusiasm that we will have a functioning strategy for waste management anytime soon." I agree with this sentiment. Whether it's because I generally try to look on the lighter side of things or not, I think I'm a little more hopeful than he is that we can overcome politics in the interest of the greater good of humanity. But other than that disagreement, I am fully on board with his statement here. I think a very important detail to point out is the extraordinary length of time in which the interview took place and how little of the interview they actually used. It has been my experience that typically when people from the media sit down for an interview that is not live and proceed to cut 90 seconds out of a 2-hour discussion, that the intention is to misleadingly craft a narrative based on the statements made by the interviewee. It seems evident to me that this is exactly what happened here. Remember that as we listen to the few statements by Dr. Serafis that they chose for this video.
Why don't we just take this nuclear waste and shoot it into space on a rocket?
If you look at the space shuttle program, which is one of the safest programs in space travel we've ever put together, we've had 2 accidents in, 200 missions? You're looking at 1 in 100.
So here he claims that we've had 2 accidents in 200 missions of the space shuttle program. He's making a wild guess, clearly, so although he is wrong, he couldn't have possibly known the precise numbers off the top of his head, so I can't hold that against him. We've actually had about 2 accidents in 135 missions as of 2011, only counting space shuttle missions. But one of those accidents should not be counted because it was an issue during re-entry, and nuclear waste would never be planned to re-enter our atmosphere. That brings us down to 1 in 135, or just under a 1% margin of error. So, statistically, his claim still works out. I just wanted to clear the math up and specify the source of that particular statistic.
The average payload on the space shuttle is a few tons. We're talking about sending 70,000 tons of material up. You're going to have an accident.
I'm going to pull the number from the Government Accountability Office here and agree that the total amount of nuclear waste in the United States is about 70,000 tons. However, going off the NASA technical paper Nuclear Waste Disposal in Space, which is the most recent document I could find that specifically referenced this statistic, the largest payload size for a shuttle specifically designed to shoot nuclear waste into space in 1978 was 101,000 kilograms, or about 111 tons. Plugging in the math, we see that we'd still have to shoot up about 631 shuttles to get rid of it all, and given our accepted 1% margin of error, that still leaves about 6 accidents. Now, it's not as bad as Dr. Serafis originally suggested, but 6 accidents is still 6 too many. So how do we account for this? My suggestion would be to continue doing what we are already doing as a result of our knowledge of this problem: set up safety failsafes. Remember that we are pulling our margin of error information from the shuttle program. These shuttles did not have to account for nuclear waste being on board and had to be built for exiting the atmosphere as well as re-entry. Nuclear waste is intended to exit the atmosphere and never come back, so re-entry would not be a factor. Additionally, normal shuttles need to leave space for their crews, as well as shield them from all sorts of atmospheric and cosmic radiation. Nuclear waste disposal shuttles would be unmanned and require no shielding from radiation coming in. Essentially what I'm saying here is that although the margin of error for shuttle missions is about the closest thing we can approximate it to, nuclear waste shuttle disposal is still radically different from manned shuttle missions. Even given a similar margin of error to the shuttle missions, safety measures could be, and have been designed, that provide almost no chance of dispersing the payload in the event of a catastrophic launch failure. I agree with Dr. Serafis in the sense that I accept that there is some risk involved, but I think the inherent risk is much smaller than it appears, and a failure would not be anywhere near as bad as it seems. The real issue here is the price tag, which is entirely too large to justify disposing of our waste in space. I expect that price to go down in the coming years, and thus justify this method of disposal, but for the time being, it is entirely too expensive. An article written by the Center for Inquiry in 2010 estimated the cost at $8 million per pound of waste disposed in space. But I want to point something out here that is very important, because they cut a crucial section of the interview out. Dr. Serafis is not so much arguing against the disposal of nuclear waste in space, as much as he is arguing that Yucca Mountain is a preferable alternative to such disposal methods. They left his argument against space disposal in because that supports their narrative, but they can't have him being supportive of Yucca Mountain, so they cut the first part of his argument out. I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment that Yucca Mountain is the superior alternative. Although I consider space disposal to be relatively safe, or at least safe enough to start implementing if the price were a non-issue, I agree with Dr. Serafis that Yucca Mountain is still better. Even if we could afford it, I would never propose that deep space disposal be the only method for disposing of nuclear waste.
Imagine, you know, the fervor that's going on now. We're talking about moving this material across country and disposing of it deep underground in our own country. Imagine the fervor if a few tons of this material was dispersed in a fine powder in the upper atmosphere all around the world.
Be a problem.
And
it would be a mess.
That's really the main reason, and not to mention the cost.
I would actually disagree. I think the largest issue with space disposal is the massive cost of doing so, and I think the fervor that Dr. Serafis is referring to stems from a gross misunderstanding from the general public concerning nuclear energy, and a passionate hatred by the public for anything involving the word nuclear. The problem with this is, as he said to me in his email, the political process of citing a repository and supporting a multi-generational project in a political culture that changes directions every 2 years, if not faster, has probably lowered my enthusiasm that we will have a functioning strategy for waste management anytime soon. Which is to say, although the science behind space disposal and Yucca Mountain is ironclad, the public is very hard to convince of this, even when presented with overwhelming evidence. This is partly due to the inherent paranoia surrounding nuclear energy, and also partly due to fear-mongering material like this Eyes of Nye episode. I think the argument Dr. Serafis is making here is that although almost everyone who is thoroughly informed wants to proceed, the general public are the people that dictate legislation, and without their approval it would be difficult if not impossible to move forward. On to Dr. Serafis' second point. While the dispersal of radioactive waste into the atmosphere would indeed be a problem, safety failsafes on board the specially crafted waste disposal shuttle could theoretically prevent such a thing from being possible. In fact, this is already included in our current plans for space disposal. To quote worldnuclear.org on the subject of waste disposal in space, the waste would be packaged so that it would be likely to remain intact upon most conceivable accident scenarios. Most of the reason we don't engage in space disposal is economic. Though of course some safety issues still remain, I would argue that the safety aspect of the issue is too often exaggerated. Again though, I agree with Dr. Serafis' original premise. Yucca is the better option.
Now, what is this business of transmuting?
Basically, the common adage or the age-old dream of turning lead into gold. We take something that has a negative value and turn it into something that'll go away, that'll either decay away within 30 years or 100 years or turn into something stable.
Let's say this is the arrangement of fuel rods in a nuclear reactor. To get rid of nuclear waste, it's been proposed that we build a different type of reactor where the reaction is more spread out, using fewer fuel rods or less concentrated ones. Now, this reactor wouldn't sustain its chain reaction, but if we could blast it with a powerful enough beam of neutrons, we could get these elements to change or transmute into lighter, shorter half-life, less radioactive elements within a few hundred years. If this works, it would be possible to transmute our high-level waste into low-level waste, and then we could bury it safely within a century or so.
Right now, when you look at Yucca Mountain or any other repository in the world, you're dealing with managing elements for hundreds of thousands of years, beyond the scope of human knowledge. If we can get that number down to 1,000 years, we can look at examples. You look at the pyramids, look at the ziggurats. We can see concrete examples of human engineering that's lasted for thousands of years.
This is one of the quotes that I asked Dr. Serafis directly about. He clarified on the quote by adding, "One of the new technologies that was being evaluated at the time of the interview was nuclear transmutation, using nuclear reactions to convert long-lived waste products into short-lived products. By combining these technologies with traditional waste management options, you can simplify the problem from one that spans hundreds of thousands of years to one that spans only 1,000 years or so, which greatly reduces the long-term uncertainty in the strategy. When looking at public and political support, the idea of protecting the environment for 100,000 or more years is usually where strategies start to lose support. Trying to convince people that we can contain the material for hundreds of years is a much easier sell, publicly and politically." I followed up by asking this question concerning a couple of the other topics from the quote. According to the Government Accountability Office and the New York Times report on the finding, Yucca Mountain was seemingly closed for political, not safety reasons. Given what we know now, with Yucca Mountain having passed all manner of stringent safety regulations and still been shut down, would you support Yucca Mountain in the miracle that politics left it alone? Do you think Yucca Mountain had actual safety issues that were being kept under wraps? Secondly, is it really fair to compare a modern superstructure to the pyramids? Our engineering and architectural prowess has made a lot of progress in the past 1,000 years. I think we are much better equipped now to build a structure that lasts much longer. He responded, "The NRC has actually released Finally, there are technical evaluations of the license application, which didn't identify any issues that would prevent licensing or imply that the proposed repository wouldn't be safe. Personally, I do believe that the Yucca Mountain site is a great location, limited water infiltration, long transport times in case of a release, and, most importantly, easily reversible if we decide that we have a better option, or, more likely, that we want to use the uranium and plutonium in the used fuel to support future reactors. Given the number of scientists and reviewers and press attention, not to mention the government's utter lack of ability to keep anything a secret for long, I don't believe any of the conspiracy theories that there is a secret science that proves the site is unacceptable, etc. The comparison to the pyramids was intended as more of a minimum. Humanity has been able to build structures that have lasted for thousands of years, so we should be able to do it again. It wasn't intended as a negative or limiting comparison. I found that last sentence particularly interesting. When I first watched his interview on the episode, I thought he was trying to disparage Yucca Mountain by comparing it to the pyramids like Bill did, but instead, he was trying to argue the opposite, and they framed it in such a way that made it seem like he was supporting Bill's pyramid argument. Essentially, what Dr. Serapis was trying to say was, if we could build a massive superstructure that lasted for thousands of years back in ancient times, what makes people think we couldn't do it significantly better now?
The question is, do we spend money now to reduce a potential problem in the future? Or do we feel that potential problem in the future is small enough that it is not worth spending resources now? You're talking about taking money from researching cancer cures, talking about taking money from schools or your tax refund and putting it towards getting rid of a problem that some people don't think is a large problem.
This was the second quote that I questioned him about. He clarified by saying, "This one came from a discussion about comparing strategies today, such as direct disposal in Yucca Mountain versus transmutation and disposal of only the short-lived waste. If you believe that the risk from the disposal of waste at Yucca Mountain is small, which I believe it is, it's hard to justify spending hundreds of billions to reduce that small risk to future populations further. If you really believe that there is a risk to future generations, is that money better spent minimizing an already small risk, or spent finding better treatments or even a cure for cancer, or improving the quality of life for millions of people today, etc." I followed up by asking, do you still consider nuclear energy and nuclear waste management to be unworthy of government funding? Or was it just transmutation you were referring to? And if so, do you still consider transmutation unworthy? He responded, "Okay, this one is a loaded question." Okay, yeah, that's fair. The way in which the statement in the video was worded seemed to appeal to emotion, and that got me riled up. I was a little upset that he would say a thing like that as I wrote the question, but it's clear now that that was taken out of context. He wasn't saying money for nuclear research would be better spent on these social programs, which already get combined more than 3,000 times over what nuclear transmutation research gets, but rather that spending money on reducing what is already a small risk even further would be useless in comparison to the good it could do elsewhere. Moving on. I very strongly believe that nuclear energy is vital to our country and the world. I don't believe there is any credible strategy for energy generation that can support the current growth in the developed world and allow the underdeveloped world access to a better lifestyle without a huge increase in greenhouse gas emissions that does not include nuclear power. That said, fiscally, I'm more libertarian, so I believe that if we actually assess the costs associated with fossil fuels, greenhouse emissions, particulate emissions, carcinogen emissions, etc., on coal, natural gas, gasoline, that the free market would shift to where nuclear projects make economic sense without government subsidy or funding. High-level waste management, and low-level as well, although it's not as polarizing an issue, are responsibilities of the federal government, state for low-level waste, under the current regulatory framework. This is a shared resource for the entire country, so I have no issues with continuing to support it at the federal level. Actually, the federal government doesn't pay for it. They collected money from the nuclear power plants to establish the Nuclear Waste Fund, which covers the cost. Transmutation. Well, the full transmutation option of converting all the long-lived products to short-lived products isn't ready for engineering scale deployment. I'm not against research to keep improving it, but it's not a viable strategy in the near term. Recycling of the actinide elements, however, provides almost all of the same benefits as the accelerator-based transmutation strategies, but could be implemented with today's technologies. Research into deploying mixed oxide fuels, recycled fuel, as well as the technologies to recycle the fuel would make a significant impact on the problem and should be part of any path forward. Following this answer, I asked permission to quote him, and Dr. Serapis had this to say in closing. The editing for the Eyes of Nye definitely seemed to give the impression that there was more technical arguments against waste management than there actually were. Most of the debate is more about how to optimize the strategy. If you recycle, do you just recycle plutonium, or also neptunium and americium? Do you separate cesium and strontium from the waste, or leave it in, etc.? The segment of our interview that was used in the show was centered around our discussions of the transmutation strategy, which UNLV, at the time, had a large grant to support our research on. Most of the discussions about Yucca Mountain and general waste management didn't make the cut. That said, I have no problem if you want to use the quotes to start the discussion. For context, most of them are about transmutation strategies versus direct disposal. Both actually would need a repository at Yucca Mountain, but the design would be a bit different. Hope that helps. Gary. This concludes the segment with Dr. Serafis. I would again like to thank him for his timely and professional responses to my questions. They really helped shine some light on his interview here.
Nuclear power offered great promise. It was created by geniuses, but there are no genius trash collectors picking up after them.
That's a hell of a position to take. I'm sure the scientific community involved in nuclear research would feel extremely insulted to hear you say such a thing, especially given the enormous impact they've had in the so-called trash collection of nuclear power in the years since its inception.
Right now, the nuclear waste problem has no solution.
Until you can provide credible evidence for such a bold claim, this is false.
Yucca Mountain is fraught with difficulties. The state of Nevada is doing all it can to stop it.
It is not fraught with difficulties. That is a lie. It has passed every ludicrously restrictive safety regulation ever shackled to it by margins they hadn't even dreamed of. Case in point, the EPA regulation for the maximum amount of dosage Yucca Mountain was allowed to leak into the surrounding area was 350 millirems a year. For comparison, as earlier stated, humans typically experience a dosage of around 620 millirems a year, and the current federal occupational limit of exposure per year for an adult is about 5,000 millirems. No adverse effects will be observed at this level. The EPA said 350 millirems a year was the max, but do you know what Yucca Mountain actually outputs? Yucca Mountain reports that their millirem dosage fluctuates between 0.24 millirems a year and 0.98 millirems a year for the next million years. That is 350 times better than they were required to do. But still, anti-nuclear organizations oppose Yucca Mountain, claiming it's unsafe, despite its ability to jump through the superfluously large amount of flaming hoops the anti-nuclear public has put in front of it. They will never admit it is safe. In regards to the water issue that Bill raised earlier, government officials explicitly stated that the waste containers will be stored in such a way as to minimize or even nearly eliminate this possibility. Let me make this abundantly clear. Yucca Mountain succeeded in passing every safety regulation in the book, but was closed for reasons that were 100% purely political. There exists no actual documented problem with Yucca Mountain whatsoever, and to claim otherwise would be a lie. As I spoke about with Dr. Serafis earlier, the Government Accountability Office and the New York Times article that reported on their finding have already said as much. To quote the GAO, the closure was for political, not technical or safety reasons. An MIT survey reported on by the Agency for Nuclear Projects found that 75% of Nevada voters opposed Yucca Mountain. 75% is an enormous majority percentage, something any politician would kill for. As such, given that it would help their polling in Nevada, Harry Reid and Barack Obama conspired to shut down Yucca Mountain, despite the fact that it was safe and working as intended. According to One Man's Planet, Earth and Today's Political Culture by Stephen M. Testa, Harry Reid had this to say about the project: Yucca Mountain is dead. It will never happen.
See, nuclear waste has been sitting out there all over the world for decades. But remember, we're talking about plutonium and very concentrated uranium. This stuff is deadly on a scale that's hard to imagine. You have to wonder, has anyone really stopped to think what 10,000 or 30,000 or 300,000 years really means?
I'm sure you're the only person that's thought of this, Bill. It's not like there are any extremely intelligent scientists in this field of study who have done actual scientific research when it comes to these kinds of questions.
No civilization in history has lasted a tenth of the half-life of this material. Now, until the waste problem is solved, for real, nuclear power doesn't do us any good. Future generations, 100 or 200 years from now, our descendants, are going to be furious with us.
You know what? I actually agree with him here. I think they are going to be furious, and not because we accepted nuclear energy, but because we rejected it. When the world energy crisis worsens in the coming years, I think these generations are going to look at us and be completely dumbfounded at how intellectually dishonest people were being about this issue, how flippantly people were willing to deny the opinion of the vast majority of scientists and at the same time claim that they had all the facts. When the invention of nuclear fusion takes years longer than it should have, you have no one to blame but yourselves, anti-nuclear community. Your irrationality, your emotional approach to a situation that necessitates level-headed logic is going to cause a lot of pain for future generations down the line.
So, solve the waste problem or shut the reactors down. Now, you're a voter or a taxpayer. Make them get it done. That's the way I see it. And I'll see you next time on The Eyes of Nye.
And as has been repeatedly demonstrated, the way you see it is behind a very thick, biased lens. Again, Bill, you've shown yourself in the past to be conscious of when you make a mistake, especially when it comes to disagreeing with the vast majority of the scientific community. It is my hope that at some point in the future, you will come to discredit this video and all the points you attempted to make in it. But until that day, I and others like me will do the best we can to show you where you went wrong and where others who hold your flawed opinion can do better in the future. If any of you out there are still not convinced as to the safety and effectiveness of nuclear energy, I would like to reveal now that
I am not offended.
In other words, I have been pulling my punches. For the entire duration of the video, I was only advocating for plutonium and uranium reactors, and I entirely left out liquid fluoride thorium reactors, which are completely immune to every criticism brought up by Bill in this video. I did this because I wanted to demonstrate that even against uranium and plutonium reactors, Bill still had no argument. Until next time, this has been Objectified Advocate reminding you not to put yourself in a box. If you approach an issue hoping that you already know the answer, often you will end up only seeing what you hoped for. Presupposition is poison to objectivity. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and comment below, and if you want to see more content like this in the future, don't forget to subscribe.